My name is DaVaughn and I'm here with
Jalen Williams.
The question right now is, what does the word poverty mean to you?
To me, poverty means the lack of something necessary like food or shelter. Poverty can be economical, social, or political.
Thank you.
According to Google, poverty is not having enough material possessions or income for a person's needs. Absolute poverty is the complete lack of means necessary to meet basic personal needs such as food, clothing, shelter, and so much more. 10.1% of the population for whom poverty status is determined in District Heights, Maryland. 600 out of 5.93 thousand people live below the poverty line, a number that is lower than the national average of 13.4%. The largest demographic living in poverty are females 12 to 14, followed by females 35 to 44, and then females 6 to 11.
Question 2. Name at least 2 ways you can change poverty in your community.
2 ways I can change poverty in my community is to try to create more jobs and to raise minimum wage.
The wealthiest country the world has ever known. And yet, he's clothed in handouts. His parents can't find work.
Say hi.
They have no home of their own. And every morning, they come to the Manor House charity, where the poor of Baltimore meet for a little food, warmth and compassion.
What is your message to President Trump?
Come and help us. Instead of critiquing us, come help us. And you will see that we need help. Bad.
Like much of America, this is a story of 2 worlds. Baltimore is actually something of a boomtown these days. But it doesn't feel like it in many parts of the city. In this economy, there is no trickle-down. Gun crime is surging here. Baltimore was even more violent than Chicago last year, driven by gang turf wars. For some of its residents, this is a city where selling your body or selling drugs is the only job available. If you want to know what poverty in America looks like, well, this is it. Incredibly, this entire block here is pretty much made up of dilapidated, abandoned houses. Incredibly, some people are still living in between this, though. Under President Obama, poverty grew in America, and President Trump says he's going to fix it. He's going to deal with what he calls the carnage in America, of crime, of drugs, of gangs, of violence, and of poverty. Well, there are few places better to try and do that than Baltimore. Marcus Alsop has lived here for 40 years. He repairs the city's homes, an eyewitness to the worst Baltimore has to offer.
The poor living are in the single houses, the row houses in Baltimore City, where they're generally rat infested regardless of what you do as a person living there. Roaches, mice, an epidemic in bed bugs. The neighborhoods are falling apart, not because the people are bad people. We're underpaid, undereducated, and so many of us have been living like this for the 2nd and 3rd generation until we don't even know how to change.
You have just seen what poverty looks like through another person's eyes.
Question 3. What causes poverty in your environment?
Things that cause poverty in our environment is lack of education and overpopulation in the state.
America is not a new problem, but the extent of the issue has seldom been brought to the attention of the entire world. That's exactly what happened recently when the United Nations Special Rapporteur took a tour of some of America's poorest places and reported back about what he found. NewsHour Weekend Special Correspondent Simon Ostrowski has our story, which was supported in part by a grant from the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. This report is part of our ongoing series about poverty and opportunity in America, Chasing the Dream.
This is Philip Alston, the United Nations point man on poverty. His job usually involves visiting the world's least developed countries. But earlier this month, Alston flipped the script.
My report demonstrates that growing inequality and widespread poverty, which afflicts almost 1 child out of every 5, has deeply negative implications for the enjoyment of civil and political rights.
The country he's talking about might not be what you'd expect. It's the United States of America, and his criticism made to the United Nations Council on Human Rights goes much, much further.
The United States has the highest income inequality in the Western world, and this can only be made worse by the massive new tax cuts overwhelmingly benefiting the wealthy.
Just days before Alston delivered his report, the United States had pulled out of the UN Human Rights Council, claiming it was stacked against U.S. ally Israel and refused to be reformed.
For too long, the Human Rights Council has been a protector of human rights abusers and a cesspool of political bias.
American ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, reacted to Alston's report with a strongly worded letter, calling the report misleading, politically motivated, and biased. She said it was patently ridiculous for the UN even to examine poverty in the wealthiest and freest country in the world. But Alston's report to the UN not only implied that U.S. policies towards poverty ignored human rights, but as a result, democracy itself is being steadily undermined.
How did you conceive of the idea to come to the United States?
The United States has long opposed the notion that there is any such thing as social human rights. The United States has for decades now stood up and said, no, there's no right to food. We think it's a good idea if people get access to food, but it's not a human right.
What Alston does want people to embrace is his belief that extreme poverty is a human rights issue, and governments have an obligation to alleviate it. But that's a controversial idea.
Well, I think it's a complicated question.
Keith Harper was President Barack Obama's last ambassador to the UN Human Rights Council.
I don't think I would go fully on board with a special rapporteur's position. Having said that, I think the way these problems often manifest in the United States could be human rights violation. If, for example, they're rooted in disparate treatment between, say, African Americans and white Americans, then you have a violation of the Convention on Racial Discrimination.
Disparate treatment is what Alston says he found.
I note with regret that United States Ambassador Nikki Haley has characterized this council as a cesspool and has chosen to withdraw from it just days before my presentation. Speaking of cesspools, my report draws attention to those I witnessed in Alabama.
As part of his poverty tour, Alston visited Lowndes County, where the Halcombs live just yards away from their town's wastewater lagoon. The irony is, their entire African-American neighborhood isn't connected to the sewer system the lagoon serves, and they rely on their own faulty septic tank.
There are no white people live nowhere around in this part, all the way back to 21. It's all black.
Your front yard looks like a lake.
He looked worse than that yesterday.
When it rains, the rest of the town's waste backs up into the Halcombs' yard.
They need to get that sewage out from over here. It shouldn't be in this neighborhood.
I hear that.
This is sewer. Okay, that must be where it's seeping through this sewer here.
So if you're trying to figure out why the United Nations felt that they had to send somebody down to Alabama, this is the reason. Open sewage bubbling up from the ground from a pipe and just coming and flooding into people's yards.
The authorities in Alabama brought sewage systems to affluent, primarily white neighborhoods decades ago. But roughly half of the homes in this mostly African-American county either don't have any septic system at all, or their systems are failing, according to Catherine Flowers, a local activist who conducted a survey of nearly 3,000 homes.
These are classic third world conditions in the richest country in the world. It makes absolutely no sense.
And of the 2,800 houses that were surveyed, what percentage had adequate sewage facilities?
Most of them, at least 50% of the people that we surveyed had failing systems or no systems at all.
What's it like living without a septic tank system?
It's bad. And I don't like to see this, stuff running out on the ground like this.
Pamela Rush is also a resident here.
So how does it work?
It's just a straight pipe run out from the house.
How come you don't have a septic tank?
I could never afford a septic tank. It was like this ever since I've been here.
Okay. How long's that been?
Over 20 years.
So the government actually doesn't consider it its responsibility to provide the infrastructure for getting rid of waste?
No. I mean, they will say, look, we've got laws on the books, and if you have a house, it's your responsibility. But of course, the bottom line is that there's an awful lot of people, not just poor people, ordinary people, who could never afford a sanitation system.
They don't recognize that they need to be.
Alabama's Chief Health Officer, Dr. Scott Harris, told us the state has never conducted a survey to assess the scope of the problem.
How many households would you say don't have proper sewage facilities?
Far too many, although we don't have great data on that. We have made efforts in the past to try to count those numbers, but we don't have a way that we're confident that we're collecting all that information. In Lowndes County, for example, we think those numbers could be, maybe 20%, or it could be significantly higher, or it might be lower, but we know that it's a substantial number of the population.
When we interviewed Philip Alston, he told us that he got the sense that the local authorities didn't feel it was their responsibility, and not only that, they didn't know how big an issue it was because they'd never conducted a survey.
I don't know about every person that he spoke with, but clearly it's an issue. We've identified it as an issue, and we've tried to educate local people on how important it is. So.
Do you think there's a problem where you see the better off white part of town being connected to the sewer system and the poorer, worse off black part of town not being connected to the system here in Lowndes County?
There's a clear racial disparity here. I mean, there's no question about it. I think people who are impoverished of any color, but particularly African American people who are impoverished, lack the social capital to be able to get their problems addressed. They are unable to get government to answer to them in the way that people who are more well off or have better connections can do.
We asked Nikki Haley's spokesperson at the mission to the UN to speak to NewsHour Weekend about Alston's report. He didn't respond to calls and emails.
Nikki Haley said it's patently ridiculous for the United Nations to be reviewing poverty in a country as rich as the United States. Do you agree with that?
I don't agree with that. I think that countries like the United States, where we have incredible wealth, are precisely the kinds of countries where if you do have poverty, you want to find out about it because we have the resources to address it.
In the case of Alabama, the challenge of providing proper waste treatment to all citizens may finally be getting addressed with proposed bipartisan legislation, in part due to the attention Alston's visit brought.
And in this day and age, everyone should have access to quality, affordable wastewater systems.
Alongside Republican legislators Mike Rogers and Shelley Capito, Democratic Congresswoman Terry Sewell and Democratic Senators Doug Jones and Cory Booker have introduced bipartisan bills in the House and Senate that, if passed, will offer federal assistance to households for sanitation systems.
How does that make Alabamans feel that the United Nations felt they needed to send somebody who they usually send to third world countries to this state?
Well, look, it really doesn't matter how they feel. What we've got to do is take that report and say, look, this is a problem. Don't shoot the messenger. That's what we say down here in the South. Just don't shoot the messenger. Let's take the message and try to build on it and work on it.
Well, what would you say to people who would argue that our tax dollars should be spent on improving our own and our children's lives instead of people who haven't been able to sort their own situation out?
Well, I think what any community does is to acknowledge that there are losers in life or people who have gone through disasters. It can happen to any of us, but those of us who are well off have safety nets, either personal or familial or whatever. These people don't have those safety nets. It's a basic tenet of decency for a society to make basic provision for the poorest and most vulnerable members.
Now we have the final question. How does poverty affect people? Poverty affects people because it doesn't allow them to purchase their everyday
That was the
needs.
end of my presentation. I hope you enjoyed.
It's been a long day without you, my friend,
And I'll tell you all about it when I see you again. We've come a long way from where we began. Oh, I'll tell you all about it when I see you again. When I see you again.
Damn, who knew? All the planes we flew, good things we've been through. That I'll be standing right here talking to you about another path. I know we love to hit the road and laugh, but something told me that it wouldn't last. Had to switch up, look at things different, see the bigger picture. Those were the days, hard work forever pays. Now I see you in a better place. How can we not talk about family when family's all that we got? Everything I would do, you were standing there by my side. And now you gon' be with me for the last ride.
It's been a long day without you, my friend. And I'll tell you all about it when I see you again. We've come a long way, from where we began.
You know, we started.
Oh, I'll tell you all about it when I see you again.
Let me tell you.
When I see you again.